The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
There are stories that history polishes into something comfortable, something easy to accept. Princess Diana is one of them. We think we know her. The radiant smile at charity hospitals. The candid interviews. The ivory wedding gown with the 25-foot train. The tearful farewell at her funeral when 1 billion people across the planet sat in stunned silence. We think we know how her story ends. But there is a chapter that has never been told cleanly, never been packaged neatly for the evening news, and it begins not with a crash in a Paris tunnel, but with a pen, a lamp, and a woman sitting alone at a mahogany desk in Kensington Palace. What she wrote that night would quietly shake the foundations of the British monarchy for decades. It would redirect millions of pounds, protect her sons from royal interference, and place the full weight of her legacy into the hands of exactly one person. Not a prince, not a palace lawyer, not a senior royal advisor. Someone they never expected, someone they deeply underestimated. And when the contents of her estate became known, it did not simply surprise people. It changed everything. To understand what Diana did with her estate, you have to understand what the royal institution did to Diana. Because her final decisions were not made in a vacuum. They were made in the aftermath of years of isolation, surveillance, emotional neglect, and public humiliation. Every clause she wrote into her will was a direct response to everything she had endured behind palace doors. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham estate. Her upbringing was aristocratic but fractured. Her parents' divorce when she was just 7 years old left a wound that never fully healed, and according to multiple biographers, that early sense of abandonment became a defining thread running through her adult life. She was not raised to be a global icon. She trained as a ballet dancer, worked briefly as a kindergarten assistant, and by all accounts was a quietly kind, somewhat shy young woman when Prince Charles began courting her in 1980. Their wedding on July 29, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral was watched by an estimated 750 million people worldwide. The dress, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, became one of the most replicated in fashion history. The world projected an entire fairy tale onto that ceremony, and Diana, barely 20 years old, stepped willingly into the role that had been scripted for her. What the cameras did not capture was a marriage already under severe strain before it properly began. Charles had never fully ended his emotional relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, and Diana later acknowledged in the famous 1995 Panorama interview with journalist Martin Bashir that she had always felt a third presence in the marriage. The interview itself, in which she spoke with remarkable composure about bulimia, self-harm, postpartum depression, and marital betrayal, was watched by approximately 23 million viewers in the United Kingdom alone. It was a seismic cultural moment. A senior royal had looked directly into a camera and told the truth. The palace was furious. Queen Elizabeth reportedly wrote to both Charles and Diana urging them to divorce quickly, and the formal separation was announced in December 1992, with the divorce finalized in August 1996. As part of the settlement, Diana lost her Royal Highness title, a deliberate institutional stripping of her royal status that she found deeply wounding. She received a lump sum settlement reported to be in the range of £17 million, along with continued use of her apartments at Kensington Palace. But losing the Her Royal Highness title did not diminish her power. If anything, it freed her. Without the constraints of being a working royal, Diana accelerated her humanitarian commitments at a pace that embarrassed the palace. Her 1987 visit to the Middlesex Hospital AIDS ward, where she shook hands without gloves with patients at a time when widespread public fear and misinformation surrounded the disease, sent a signal around the world that compassion required no protective barrier. Her 1997 visit to Angola, where she walked through active minefields in jeans and a protective vest, brought the global landmines crisis to the front pages of newspapers in over 50 countries. The Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel mines was signed later that same year, and international campaign leaders have directly credited Diana's advocacy with accelerating political will toward that agreement. She visited leprosy wards, embraced homeless children, and sat with the grieving and the forgotten in a way that no member of the royal family had ever done publicly. According to Andrew Morton's biography Diana, her true story, which was based on secret recordings Diana made herself, she understood that her emotional accessibility was something the monarchy could never manufacture and desperately wanted to control. She used it deliberately. Every handshake, every unscripted tear, every moment of genuine human connection was also, at some level, an act of defiance. She was building something the institution could not touch. And when it became clear that she would not live inside the palace's silence forever, she made a decision to ensure that what she had built would survive her. In the summer of 1996, with her divorce finalized and her personal finances newly independent, Diana sat down with her legal team and wrote what would become one of the most closely analyzed and quietly explosive documents in modern British history. Her will. On the surface, the structure appeared straightforward. Her estate, valued at the time at approximately £17 million and comprising jewelry, personal effects, her stake in the Althorpe estate, and various financial assets, was to be divided with the majority going toward charitable causes she had championed, and a portion held in trust for her two sons, William and Harry. Specifically, according to documents that have been analyzed by royal commentators and legal observers over the years, approximately 75% of the estate's value was directed toward humanitarian causes. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, which was formally established after her death in August 1997, went on to distribute over £140 million to causes including HIV and AIDS research, landmine clearance initiatives, palliative care programs, and children's welfare organizations across multiple continents. This was not the gesture of someone managing public relations from beyond the grave. This was the deliberate continuation of a humanitarian program she had spent a decade building. For her sons, she set aside funds held in structured trusts, designed specifically so that the money would serve their education and future independence while remaining beyond the reach of palace financial administration. She had watched how the institution operated closely enough to know that money, like information, could be used as a form of control. The trusts were constructed with that in mind. But then came the element that no one had anticipated, and that changed the reading of everything else. Diana named Paul Burrell as the executor of her estate. Paul Burrell had served as Diana's butler since 1987. He had been a footman to Queen Elizabeth before that, so he understood the machinery of royal household management in intimate detail. But his relationship with Diana evolved into something far more personal than professional protocol allowed for. He was, by multiple accounts, one of the very few people she genuinely trusted during the most turbulent years of her life. According to his own memoir, A Royal Duty, published in 2003, he was present for conversations that have never been fully made public, received letters that she entrusted to no one else, and understood the nuances of her wishes in ways that no solicitor could replicate from a distance. By naming Burrell as executor, Diana placed the administrative authority over her entire estate in the hands of someone whose primary qualification was not legal expertise but personal loyalty and genuine understanding. He would oversee distributions to charity, manage the personal effects, and exercise discretionary judgment over the countless small decisions that arise in the administration of a complex estate. The palace's reaction was swift and severe. Lawyers representing the royal family and Charles's household began raising concerns about the appointment almost immediately. There were murmurings about Burrell's suitability, about the propriety of a domestic staff member holding such authority, and about the potential for mismanagement. In royal circles, the discomfort was barely concealed. What made the situation more charged was that Burrell possessed knowledge. He had been there. He had seen the letters, heard the late-night phone calls, understood the full architecture of Diana's emotional and personal life in ways that made him uniquely powerful and uniquely threatening to people who preferred that architecture remain buried. Diana had not chosen him carelessly. She had chosen him precisely because he was the one person who could not be easily pressured, redirected, or absorbed into the institutional machinery of the palace. He was her voice, and she had positioned him legally to remain so. The tension reached its most public and dramatic point in 2002, when Paul Burrell was charged with theft. The accusation was that he had taken 310 personal items belonging to Diana, including dresses, letters, photographs, and ceremonial artifacts, without authorization following her death. The trial began at the Old Bailey and drew international media attention. The proceedings were extraordinary for what they revealed about the interior life of the royal family and about the contested nature of Diana's legacy. Witnesses spoke about the chaos that followed her sudden death in Paris on August 31, 1997, and about the informal arrangements that had been made regarding her personal possessions. The trial was abruptly halted when Queen Elizabeth recalled a private conversation she had held with Burrell shortly after Diana's death, in which Burrell had told the Queen he was taking some items for safekeeping. The charges were dropped. The collapse of the trial raised more questions than it answered. Why had the prosecution proceeded for so long without that conversation being raised? Why had the palace allowed a loyal servant to face criminal charges over an arrangement that, it turned out, the Queen herself had been aware of? Royal observers have suggested that the trial was, at least partly, an attempt to exert control over the materials Burrell held, materials that included deeply personal correspondence and documents that the palace would have preferred to remain private. When the charges were dropped, Burrell moved forward with the publication of A Royal Duty in 2003. The book quoted from private letters Diana had written to him and shed details of her inner emotional life that had never before been made public. Reaction within the royal family was fierce. Prince William reportedly described the publication as a betrayal. Prince Charles is said to have been equally furious. The book became a bestseller. What the Burrell episode demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than anything else, was that Diana's decision to make him executor was not a sentimental choice. It was a strategic one. She had created a situation in which the person who held the most knowledge about her private wishes also held the legal authority to act on them, and was not subject to royal household discipline or pressure. In a family and an institution where information was routinely managed, suppressed, or reframed, she had placed the one person who knew the unvarnished truth in a position of formal authority. It was, viewed from a certain angle, an act of institutional genius. Burrell later oversaw the sale of a significant collection of Diana's personal items, including clothing and jewelry, through auction. A 2010 sale raised approximately £1.2 million, with proceeds benefiting charitable causes she had supported. A sapphire and diamond bracelet from her personal collection sold at auction for significantly above its estimated value, as collectors around the world competed for tangible connection to her story. Each of these events, each auction, each publication, each revelation, continued the work that Diana had begun. Her presence in public consciousness did not diminish after 1997. If anything, it intensified, and Burrell's stewardship of her materials was central to that ongoing intensity. The most human dimension of Diana's estate planning was always the provision she made for her sons. Both William, born in 1982, and Harry, born in 1984, were at the center of everything she did in the final years of her life. The trusts she established were designed not simply to transfer wealth, but to provide a form of financial independence that the palace could not leverage as a tool of compliance. Royal biographers and commentators have noted that Diana was acutely aware of how institutional financial dependence could be used to shape behavior within the royal family. Members who relied entirely on the sovereign grant on allowances administered by the senior household were, structurally, less free to dissent, to deviate from approved positions, or to speak publicly about their own experiences. By creating separately administered trusts for her sons, Diana removed that particular instrument of control. The emotional cost of her death, and of the legacy she left behind, played out in dramatically different ways for the two brothers. William, as heir to the throne, was absorbed more completely into the institutional identity of the monarchy. His grief was managed publicly and privately in ways consistent with the expectations of his future role. He channeled his loss into formal charitable work, including the establishment of the Diana Award, which continues to recognize young people for humanitarian and community efforts. Harry's experience was starkly different. In his 2023 memoir Spare, he described the years following his mother's death as a period of profound psychological disruption, complicated by the demands placed on him to perform composure in public while processing trauma privately. He was explicit about the disconnect between the institution's expectations and his own emotional reality. His eventual decision to step back from senior royal duties in 2020, and his subsequent relocation with his wife Meghan Markle to California, was framed in terms that strongly echoed the language Diana herself had used about the palace. He described institutional behavior, pressure to conform, and the suppression of authentic emotional experience in ways that drew direct and obvious lines back to his mother's documented experiences. Whether or not those parallels were consciously constructed, they were unmistakable. Diana's estate, both the material assets and the moral legacy, had shaped the trajectory of her younger son's life in ways she could not have fully predicted but might, with some part of her extraordinary political intuition, have anticipated. The relationship between William and Harry became strained in ways that also carried echoes of Diana's own experience. The differing positions they occupied, heir and spare, institutional and independent, created tensions that played out publicly and painfully. Diana had hoped that her estate planning would protect both sons equally. The reality was more complex, as it always is when money and grief and family and institutional power are woven together. It is worth stepping back from the personal and political drama to look at what Diana's estate actually accomplished in measurable terms, because the numbers are extraordinary. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund distributed over £140 million between its establishment in 1997 and its closure in 2012. Its grants supported HIV and AIDS programs across sub-Saharan Africa at a time when antiretroviral treatment was becoming available but funding for distribution remained critically insufficient. It supported landmine clearance programs in countries including Angola, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Mozambique. It funded palliative care initiatives in the United Kingdom and internationally, reflecting Diana's deeply held belief that how societies treat their most vulnerable members is a measure of their moral character. The Landmines Campaign, which Diana had personally championed in the months before her death, achieved a landmark international agreement. The Ottawa Treaty, or the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Antipersonnel Mines and on their destruction, was signed by 122 nations in December 1997, just months after her death. The international campaign to ban landmines received the Nobel Peace Prize that same year. By the early 2020s, more than 55 million stockpiled mines had been destroyed, and clearance operations in former conflict zones had rendered millions of square meters of previously deadly land safe for habitation and agriculture. Her AIDS advocacy had similarly lasting consequences. The reduction of stigma around HIV and AIDS, to which her public gestures of compassion contributed meaningfully, created conditions in which public health communication could be more effective. The United States government's PEPFAR initiative, launched in 2003, represented the largest commitment by any single nation to address a disease in history, and the broader cultural shift in how HIV-positive individuals were treated was part of the landscape that made such political will possible. Althorpe, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire, where Diana is buried on a small island in the ornamental lake, was open to the public following her death. It receives tens of thousands of visitors annually and houses the Diana Museum, which presents her life, her work, and her humanitarian commitments. For many visitors, it serves as a place of genuine pilgrimage, a physical location where the grief that followed her death can be acknowledged and honored. These are not abstractions. These are policies that changed, laws that were written, and lives that were extended or improved as a direct consequence of how Diana directed her wealth, her attention, and her moral authority. There is a tendency, when discussing Princess Diana, to focus on the tragedy, the youth, the beauty, the marriage that collapsed in public, the death in a Paris tunnel at 36 years old, the grief that swept across the world in September 1997 with a force that surprised even those who had followed her story closely. But the more instructive story, and the one that her estate planning makes visible, is about something else entirely. It is about a woman who understood power deeply, who had watched it operate from the inside of one of the most powerful institutions in the world, and who systematically worked to redirect it toward people who had none. Her decision to name Paul Burrell as executor was not an act of sentimentality. It was an act of tactical precision. By placing someone who was personally loyal but institutionally independent at the center of her estate's administration, she created a buffer between her wishes and the forces that would have preferred to manage, dilute, or quietly redirect them. Her decision to direct the majority of her estate toward humanitarian causes rather than toward the enrichment of individuals within the royal family was equally deliberate. She had spent her marriage watching how institutional wealth was managed and deployed, and she had seen how it functioned as a mechanism of control. Her will was a statement that wealth could also be a mechanism of liberation, for AIDS patients who needed treatment, for communities recovering from landmine contamination, for children without families, and for her own sons who needed financial independence from a system that had not been kind to their mother. Diana left her estate to one person in the sense that mattered most. Not in a legal sense, because her assets were distributed across multiple trusts and charitable organizations.